Hi, I'm Dr. Keith Volstad.
And I'm Laura McLeod Volstad of Volstad Chiropractic and Integrated Wellness. We're located at 275 Tony Penna Drive, Suite 12, right here in Jupiter. And our telephone number is 746-4242. We'd like to welcome you to this week's edition of the Chiropractic Corner, a weekly show spotlighting the chiropractic profession and what doctors of chiropractic do to improve their patients' health. In this program, Dr. Volstad and I plan to cover topics that pertain to your health from a complementary and alternative medicine point of view. These topics will include spinal injury issues like neck pain, low back pain, bulging discs, pinched nerves, and sports injuries, lifestyle medicine, dietary and nutritional advice, nutraceuticals, and supplementation, just to name a few. We'd like to encourage you to email us about topics that you'd like to hear discussed on this program. You can do that by emailing us at imchiro1, the number 1, at gmail.com. That's M as in Mary, CHIRO, the number 1, at gmail.com.
Before we get started, Laura, I'd like to say that we are dedicating this show to Rich.
Oh, yes.
Who is the motivation and inspiration for this week's edition of the Chiropractic Corner.
This week, we thought we would devote our show to a topic that's on all of our minds and our bodies, apparently, and that is stress.
Stress. What a wonderful thing.
We hear about it all the time.
Yep, we sure do.
You know, stress kills, stress is not good for you, stress this, stress that. But what are the physiological effects of stress? We hear that stress isn't good for us, Doc, and we know why it gets us uptight and all of those things, but I know there's so much more going on behind that, and I would just love it if we could get you to share some of the really physiological things that affect our bodies from stress.
Well, that's a great idea, and I think that's a wonderful topic for our show. I think the thing to remember, Laura, though, is that this is a rather complex issue, and what we'll discuss in this week's show is just kind of a tip of the iceberg type of thing. Okay, so just, let's get started.
Okay, let's just talk about stress in general. First of all, what is it?
What is stress? Well,
the big $24,000 question.
Stress,
$64,000.
There you go.
Oops, wrong show.
Stress is life. I mean, your life is comprised of different stresses. It's basically the paradigm of how an organism interacts with its environment. So everything that the organism goes through in its environment is stress. It's also defined as a non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. So it doesn't have to be a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something that occurs to our body and our body responds to it. That would be stress. It's also a general adaptive response in order to cope with the altered change in balance. The term we use is homeostasis. Homeostasis is challenged. The body is demanded upon, and that changes the homeostasis. So our response to that is what we call stress.
Doctor word.
Okay.
Homeostasis.
Homeostasis is the tendency of an organism or a cell to regulate its internal conditions, usually by a system of feedback controls, so as to balance or stabilize its health and its function. And this is done regardless of the changes that are outside the cell. Okay?
Okay.
I hope that made it a lot clearer.
All right. Let's drill it down a little bit specifically. Can we talk about stress in humans, like short-term? I know there's short-term stress, there's long-term or chronic stress.
Right.
And, why it's important. And
okay, just one last thing about what stress is. Think of it this way. Think of it that there's some kind of a stimulus, in parentheses, stressor, that causes an alarm reaction within our body, whether it's emotional or physical. And this stressor then that causes the reaction creates a disturbance in our homeostasis, which we just defined. And then we, as an organism, respond to that. We call that an adaptive response. And that adaptive response is designed to restore the homeostasis. That's basically what stress is. All right, let's get to your other question about short-term versus long-term. Short-term stress would be a good thing. You're driving your car. Suddenly the person in front of you slams on their brakes.
Yikes.
If you didn't respond to that stimulus, do an adaptive response to that stimulus, you would probably end up in my office with a sore neck because you would run into the back of that car. So that short-term stress response is a good thing because you're responding to something that would get you out of danger. Okay?
Like an adrenaline rush.
An adrenaline rush. And that's a good thing because it's a protective adaptation. Another example of a short-term stress would be your body's response to infection. Infection can be a bad thing, but your body responds to it. It recognizes the infection as a stressor. That infection creates an alarm. Uh-oh, I'm infected. The body then responds to that stress by stimulating the immune system to attack the infection. The immune system destroys the infection, thus, once again, establishing homeostasis or balance. That's another example of short-term stress, and it is a good thing. Okay?
Okay.
Now we have long-term stress, and it's long-term stress that is the bad thing. Our bodies are designed to handle short-term stress. We have the fight or flight syndrome, the adrenaline rush, like you called it. That's a good thing. But when that goes on over and over and continues without relief, then it can become a real major problem.
Well, what kind of problems are we talking about, Doc? What sort of issues physiologically could result from having long-term chronic stress?
Okay, that's a great question. So let me first describe some of the things that can cause long-term stress.
Okay.
Something like your high-pressure job. If you have a long-term relationship problem. Financial problems can create long-term stress. Loneliness, that's a big one in today's world. We've kind of isolated ourselves with video games and texting and cell phones, and believe it or not, that can generate loneliness, which can be a long-term stress.
Even though you're communicating with other people through those devices.
I would think that's true, yes. We long for that human contact.
Okay. Very interesting. You text and game junkies, listen up.
Yeah, it's an important aspect of the emotional involvement that we get into these video games, that we tend to isolate ourselves from those around us because we basically are so engrossed in the game.
And humans need humans.
That's right.
What's the saying, Doc? You know, they say you need 9 hugs a day to stay healthy.
Okay.
Have you heard that?
Something like that, but I don't know that I could repeat it. So if you say that's what it is, I'll believe
human
you.
touch. I think I heard that number a long time ago. You need 9 hugs a day. So you guys start counting your hugs.
There you go.
Give and get.
One last thing I'd like to include in the causes of long-term stress is chronic pain. We see a lot of chronic pain in our office, and it is a very debilitating event. And it can lead to chronic stress in our bodies, not only from the injury which causes the chronic pain, but also the emotional load that we carry when we deal with chronic pain. You know, that pain day after day after day.
That's right. I remember my dad suffered from 3 unsuccessful back surgeries way back many years ago, and always suffered from chronic pain in his back and his leg from that for the rest of his life. And as we've mentioned, it can bring on a myriad of things. Like in his case, a little bit of depression. It severely curtailed his activity level, which brought on a little bit of weight gain, which cascaded several years later into type 2 diabetes. And so he had to deal with that. Yeah,
that chronic stress can really wreak havoc with your health, like in your dad's case, resulting in him developing type 2 diabetes. The inactivity, but it's also the result of chronic stress and its effects on our body.
Right. It's just a cascading effect.
Okay, moving on with long-term stress, there are a couple of things that need to be pointed out. What systems in our body respond to stress? Well, there are basically 3 systems that I'd like to include in this discussion. The first system that responds to stress is the nervous system. That is our brain and the nerves that are in our body. The second system is the hormonal system relating to that adrenaline rush that you talked about. Adrenaline is epinephrine, which is a hormone produced by the adrenal gland. Then we have the epigenetic response. In other words, how the stress of our environment influences how our genes are expressed. A classic example of that we're going to talk about a little bit later is cancer. Cancer can be, and very commonly is, a result of a genetic change within our body.
Wow.
Let's talk about the nervous system, because to be a little bit more specific.
Okay.
The nervous system has several parts to it. You've got your brain and spinal cord, which is called the central nervous system. You've got the nerves that are in your arms, legs, hands, etc. That's called the peripheral nervous system. And then you've got part of your nervous system that controls the automatic functions of your body, and we call that the autonomic nervous system. So when you sit down and eat a meal and your food starts to digest, you don't have to tell your gut to start digesting the food. It just happens automatically. And that part of your body is controlled by what we call the autonomic nervous system.
Okay.
Now, to break it down even further, the autonomic nervous system has two parts to it. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I know we're going into some detail, but it is important to understand this concept as it relates to stress. The sympathetic nervous system is that part of your nervous system, simply put, that controls the flight or fight syndrome. So when you get that adrenaline rush, it's the sympathetic nervous system that is in action. But when you have that big turkey dinner on Thanksgiving and you go sit on the couch and you start to fall asleep because you get sleepy after you eat,
tryptophan.
That is the parasympathetic nervous system in control. So the relaxed, chilled out, I'm getting sleepy, parasympathetic. I'm excited, I'm scared, I'm on edge, I want to fight or fly. That's the sympathetic nervous system. And that's important to note as it relates to the stress response that we have in our body. It is the sympathetic nervous system that is chronically stimulated when we have a long-term stress response. There's a system in our body called the HPA axis, which is responsible for the release of hormones that occur when we have a stress response. HPA stands for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal. That's what it stands for. I thought you might be interested in knowing that. But it is this system that is responsible for our response to stress.
Okay.
Now, the truth of the matter is that this system is being chronically stimulated by long-term stress. And while your body can deal with it on a short term, it has a very difficult time dealing with it over a long-term process, and that is in what ends up damaging your body. For example, let's talk about stress and how it affects hypertension. Hypertension, we know, is elevated blood pressure. What causes that? Well, when our bodies release epinephrine or adrenaline, what's one of the things we notice? Our heart rate goes up, doesn't it? And our heart feels like it's pounding out of our chest.
Right.
That's because the body has triggered the response of our cardiovascular system to prepare us to fight or fly. And in doing so, our heart rate is higher and the heart beats harder. Thus, the pressure within the circulatory system goes up. Now, think about that over a long, long time. If we have a long-term stress situation, like you might have on your job or financial woes, etc., this process may not be as pronounced as it might be if you almost hit the car in front of you, but it is still there. Your heart rate is elevated, and the pressure or the strength within which the heart beats is stronger, so your blood pressure goes up. Now we have hypertension. If we do nothing to resolve the stress, that hypertension stays. And as we all know, hypertension can lead to a number of cardiovascular issues, such as stroke especially, but it can also lead to heart disease.
Wow, serious stuff.
Serious stuff. Now, it's not going to be done in 2 or 3 days, but over the course of 20 years, it certainly can result in major cardiac events.
Yumpin' yiminy, Doc. Those are some serious consequences of stress. I mean, that it could cause cancer or hypertension, or I'm afraid to ask. Is there anything else on the list?
Believe it or not, there are quite a few things on the list. Let's talk about how it affects how our body metabolizes sugar.
Okay.
The unfortunate side effect, a fortunate side effect of this is that it affects the way our body processes sugar. We can develop what's called insulin resistance from long-term chronic stress. Insulin is the hormone produced by the pancreas, as we probably all know.
You're going to say the D word, aren't you?
That facilitates the movement of sugar into the cells. And when that doesn't work right, the sugar then builds up within the bloodstream. And you're right, that's diagnosed as diabetes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that can cause diabetes is chronic stress.
Wow.
In addition to
Who knew?
that, not only does the sugar metabolism get messed up, but fat metabolism can be messed up as well. And so we end up with elevated fat in our bloodstream as well. So if you have ever heard of Syndrome X, that's a syndrome that is made up of several different things, which include elevated blood sugar, elevated triglycerides, as well as hypertension and obesity. Those four things coupled together are what we term Syndrome X. And that can lead to a diabetic state.
Well, Doc, I've also heard that stress could lead to ulcers. Is that true?
That's a common thing that you hear a lot about,
Yeah.
the high pressure job like the stockbroker or the commodities guy down on Wall Street is developing ulcers because of the pressures and stress of his job.
Right.
Well, the truth is stress does not really cause an ulcer. Ulcers are caused by a bacteria, H. pylori. However, once you have the ulcer, stress can certainly exacerbate the condition and make it a lot worse. The other thing that the chronic stress does, Laura, is it diminishes our immune system. This is important in our ability to fight off infection. Since ulcers are, in fact, an infection, the diminished immune system can't fight the ulcer, so our body gets overcome by the ulcer and it gets worse. So the cause of the ulcer is, in fact, an infection, but because we're dealing with a chronic stress scenario, the ulcer is allowed to get worse and becomes a major, major issue. Now, since the immune system is diminished, our ability to fight off other infections are diminished as well. So people who are under chronic stress get things like colds, sinusitis, flus, and other infections. So it is important to understand that chronic stress can lead to the inability of our body to fight off infection.
Interesting. Oh, I'm afraid to ask another one. Think I'll just stop it right there.
Well, there are two other things I would like to cover, if
Oh,
you
boy.
don't mind.
What else?
Well, earlier, Laura, we had talked about cancer. And what I'd like to do is just very quickly give the brief description of how chronic stress can create a cancerous situation in our body. However, it's going to be a bit technical. And I hope people can kind of understand that I'm just relaying this information with the understanding that you may not quite understand what I'm talking about. But there are structures within our genetic code called oncogenes. These genes are part of what we call the epigenetic structures, those structures that are associated with our genes but are actually outside of them.
Okay.
And when the stress of an environment can affect these oncogenes then don't function correctly, which allows then cells to proliferate themselves on and on and on because they're not turned off by a normally functioning oncogene.
So, question, sir.
Yes.
It's a damaged cell that doesn't work quite right, and that's what begins to reproduce out of
Yes.
control, and your body doesn't take care of it, and so
Right.
it just continues to reproduce itself.
That's correct. And it's controlled in a number of different ways, but one of them is by these epigenetic structures called oncogenes. And now the environment can stress, quote unquote, these oncogenes to not function correctly, so cell division doesn't turn off, and the cells then to start dividing, like you said. Now, another effect, changing the subject, is our brain. How often under stress do we think that we just can't focus and our energy is diminished?
That never happens to me.
That's chronic stress. It's interesting to note that the opposite is true of short-term stress. When you have short-term stress, you are focused and you are zeroed in and you've got the energy to get that job done. But that's short-term. When it becomes long-term, now all of a sudden the exact opposite occurs. Our focus goes away and our energy is diminished. One last thing I would like to discuss before we talk about treatment is the release of a chemical substance caused by long-term stress, and that is cortisol.
Oh, we've heard that word before.
Yep. Cortisol is released by the adrenals, and in short term, it's like epinephrine. It can help our bodies deal with the stress in a very positive way. But when cortisol is released on a long-term process, it has a number of negative effects with our body, of which one is the fear center of our brain is stimulated, so we become fearful. The area of our brain which deals with learning and memory is negatively affected, so our ability to remember things and to learn new things is diminished. So we can then combine this stuff and we become anxious and we become fearful, and then we fall into depression. And the other thing cortisol can do is it can literally diminish the size of our brain. Thus, it affects our concentration, our ability to make decisions, our judgment. It also affects our desire for social interaction. And the extremes would be depression and ultimately possibly Alzheimer's disease. So you can see that the effects of chronic stress are mind-boggling. You know, it deals with hypertension, thus the cardiovascular system. It deals with metabolism, resulting in insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes. It deals with our immune system, resulting potentially in the exacerbation of an ulcer. It can lead to cancer. It can lead to dysfunction within our brain, resulting in depression and ultimately, possibly, even Alzheimer's. So stress is a horrible, horrible thing when left unchecked.
That sounds like a really nasty cocktail.
It is tough.
Okay, now, that said, how do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
Tell me there's a fix out there.
Well, I think there certainly is. Certainly the emotional aspect of it, you may need some therapy, which is something that certainly I'm not qualified to do, but it is an important side that needs to be dealt with, especially with those who have anxiety and depression. But from a physiological perspective, there are several things that can be done. One of the most important that's easily done by everybody is exercise.
Yeah, right.
What exercise does is it burns up the adrenaline, the cortisol, and it fatigues us, but it diminishes the activity of the chemicals that are released by chronic stress. So because they are diminished, they don't have the effect on our body that they would if they were left unchecked.
Doesn't it also, exercise also release feel-good hormones in your brain?
Endorphins and cephalons, absolutely.
And
all of those things that can result in that feel-good sensation.
Hard to get started, but once you do,
that's right.
It feels good.
You're right. It's very difficult to get started, but it is imperative that you force yourself to do that because exercise is key to the reduction of chronic stress and its effects on our body. Certainly dietary management is important. Taking appropriate nutraceuticals, magnesium, omega-3s, for example, help our bodies deal with the effects of chronic stress. Eating the right kinds of foods, staying away from the sugars and the alcohol, which are things that overstimulate our body or, in the case of alcohol, depress our body.
Right.
You know, it's already depressed, maybe mentally. The alcohol will only make things worse. So dietary management is a key component. Another important aspect in the therapy of chronic stress is meditation. Things like yoga, etc., or spiritual meditation, taking time to calm your brain and to provide that peace and quiet that meditation can provide, however you deem that within your personal life, can certainly go a long way to help with chronic stress. And the other thing I would like to take the opportunity to mention at this time, Laura, is the new technology that we have in our office.
Oh, yes.
The Magnosphere.
Yeah.
Research has shown that low levels of magnetic resonance can balance the body, getting that parasympathetic, sympathetic balance back, as well as reducing that chronic pain that we talked about earlier, like your dad's situation. Mm-hmm. That could result in the reduction of the effects of chronic stress. Mm-hmm. If you remember earlier in our discussion, we talked about the autonomic nervous system and the two components that make it up, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. Very commonly, when patients have chronic long-term stress, those two systems are out of balance, with the sympathetic being much more in control of our bodily functions than the parasympathetic. Mm-hmm. What magnetic resonance therapy can do is it can restore a more normal balance between those two components of the autonomic nervous system. And it's interesting to note that we actually can monitor this rebalancing of these two systems through a process known as heart rate variability monitoring. We have the ability at our office to monitor your heart rate variability, which can then indicate to us that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are balancing, resulting in the reduction of the effects of chronic stress on your body.
Okay, thanks, Doc. Wow, that's a lot to digest about a subject that we've heard a lot about, but have never really known how physiologically injurious it could be to our bodies.
Uh-oh, doctor speak. Physiologically injurious?
I know, and it came from me.
That's right. Good job, Laura.
Well, that about wraps it up for another edition of the Chiropractic Corner. Dr. Volstad and I would like to thank you for listening, and don't forget to let us know what questions you may have for Doc or topics you'd like to learn more about by emailing us at M as in Mary, CHIRO, 1, @gmail.com. We're located at 275 Tony Penna Drive, Suite 12, right here in Jupiter. And our telephone number is 746-4242. We'd love to hear from you. Google Volstad Chiropractic to find our website for more information about our office or to listen to archived programs from the Chiropractic Corner. For those on Facebook, please search and find our Facebook page and give us a like. We post a lot of information about healthcare and natural remedies that you can use at home. Join us next weekend for another edition of the Chiropractic Corner, right here on WJUP, The Jupe, 103.9 FM, Friday morning at 9 a.m., right after the Dick Farrell live show, and again Saturday, right after the 10 a.m. news. Until then, be well, live well. We'll see you next week.